Mirjana, Ivan, shall we start?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So, good morning and welcome everybody. My name is Daniela Klaus. I'm the General Secretary of Presseclub Concordia. Welcome to our conversation with Ivan Krastev. Ivan, welcome. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to have you as our guest. I'm so happy. This is kind of a tradition. It's for the third time that you are our guest on the 13th of January. So it's a perfect way to start the year. This is an event that is organized and hosted by fjum, Forum for Journalism and Media, and Presseclub Concordia. Both organizations are in Vienna. And with this series of talks, we are trying to give input, but also foster networking among journalists, think tankers, experts. Our guests today, again, are from basically, I think I can say everywhere in the world. So welcome to everybody, wherever you might be. It's great that you are here today. I'm so happy that you joined these conversations. Ivan is one of the most original and influential political thinkers and analysts in Europe. So he really is the best guest to start the year and to reflect on what happened, but also what is going to happen. Mirjana Tomić, welcome very much, will introduce Ivan, and she will also lead this conversation today. I just want to mention that Mirjana organizes an excellent series of talks online and offline, and I hope to see you all again in the next talks and in the next events we are organizing. But as I said before, I'm always trying to be very short in the beginning. And Mirjana, I'm really looking forward to this talk. Ivan, Mirjana, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Ivan, for accepting to be our guest and interlocutor for the third time. Hope it becomes a tradition. Just a few words about Ivan, and you will be able to see, my colleagues will post his full CV in the chat. Ivan Krastev is the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, Bulgaria, and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. In 2019, he was awarded a Mercator Senior Fellowship, and in 2020, both the Jean Améry Prize for European Essay Writing and Lionel Gelber Prize for the book The Light That Failed, A Reckoning. Beyond this very brief introduction, please see the link of his books that have been translated in over 20 languages and his other numerous activities. When I invited Ivan for this conversation, my idea was to focus on the topic of his current research and interest, which is demography and democracy in Europe. However, the reality, namely COVID reality, obliges me to start with COVID and its impact on democracy. So I shall basically focus on three topics: demography and democracy, COVID and democracy, and last, the impact of COVID for 2022. Of course, the audience can ask any other question and address other topics. I will speak with Ivan for about 30 minutes, and then we shall open the screen for live discussions. In April 2020, Ivan, you wrote, "Is it tomorrow yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic." Your book was among the first reactions on the pandemic and its consequences. At the time, there was hope that vaccines should solve the problem. And as you pointed in one of your interviews, governments promised citizens a full protection, something like, "You're not going to die." However, vaccines became not only a medium to stop the virus, but also to compete at the international scene. We entered the era of vaccine diplomacy. US, Europe, Russia, and China entered the political medical race. The virus is still around, but the choice of vaccines determined where you could travel or what you can do, and it remains so. My first question, has anyone won this vaccine diplomacy, or we are all losers? Does it mean anything who wins or loses this competition for the rest of citizens of our world and Europe? Europe. Ivan, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Listen, it's not easy to answer this question because in a certain way, all this kind of a competition about vaccine is not over. But the vaccines has become part of our national passports. In a certain way, what kind of a vaccine do you have very much regulate where you can go or you cannot go. And if in the beginning, the biggest problem was the promise, and there was a lot of conversations about who is going to be vaccinated first. On this level, countries like China and Russia were kind of very eager to announce that they're ready basically to export their vaccines. But here you have kind of the paradox of the vaccines and vaccines diplomacy. As you know, Sputnik 5 was the first vaccines to be announced by the Russian government that had been in circulation. As a result of it, basically Russia was a country that managed to make the contracts with a lot of countries around the world, Latin America particularly, in order to sell them their vaccines. But the paradox is that while basically Russia has its own vaccines, the level of vaccination within the Russian Federation is very low, by the way, very similar to what you're going to see of some of other East European countries. So as a result of it, the fact that you have your own vaccine does not mean that your vaccine, that your population is much more ready to get vaccinated. Secondly, while I do believe that in general, the quality of the Sputnik 5 was fine for this type of a vaccine, it appears that it was very difficult for the Russian Federation to come with the qualities that they had promised. So as a result of it, you have contracts, particularly with countries like Argentina and others, where you cannot deliver. China is an interesting story if you trust the latest data coming also from the World Health Organization. In fact, the early Chinese vaccines are the least effective. On the other side, politically, it appeared that many of the countries, it was in a certain way the best vaccines, the RNA vaccines that produced most political backlash and much more debate because of being of a new type of vaccines. So, but the bigger reality is that they're part of the worlds which are highly vaccinated, and this is basically the Western world. And there are parts of the world which is with a very low vaccinations, and of course this is highest in Africa. So when you're asking me how and who is winning this type of a vaccine diplomacy, it's not easy to answer, as I told you, because in a certain way we have such a backlash against vaccines in certain places that you don't know how kind of you're gaining or losing out of pretending that you can vaccinate the world. This is the reality, and this reality tells us something about certain expectations about other areas. One of the things that was very striking for me is that if in 2 or 3 years ago, imagine that we have the same conversation, and you are going to ask me a question, what kind of a crisis is going to push governments to cooperate most globally? And then obviously it's not going to be a classical war, it's not going to be also migration. Climate change, of course, could be an area, but because of the fact that it has very much uneven effects, some places are going to be affected much earlier than others. You can expect that it was exactly the pandemic like this one that is going to push governments to cooperate. And the reality was that they didn't. And from this point of view, the experience of the pandemic for the last 2 years globally shows that while you can expect cooperation because of the fact that it was a global pandemic, it affected everybody, it was very much about interdependence. You cannot close your country from the others. At the end of the day, in a certain way, it made the borders of the world much more visible, not less visible.
Thank you very much. This brings me exactly to the second question. And vaccines and anti-COVID measures adopted by different countries, and I'm speaking Europe, have divided European citizens along many lines. Supporters of vaccination versus anti-vaxxers, highly vaccinated countries versus non-vaccinated countries. The poll conducted by the institution where you are part, the European Council of Foreign Relations, revealed that the level of vaccination does not really correspond to the perception of how the pandemic affected one's life. And I'm going to quote what you wrote. The lived experience of the COVID-19 pandemic has split Europe, just as the Euro and the refugee crisis did, with the South and the East feeling much more badly affected than the North and the West. Europe's COVID-19 experience has been a tale of two pandemics, and the differences in each story could haunt the continent for many years to come. And the divisions are not only now beginning to surface, and are only now beginning to surface, and they will soon start to shape many citizens' attitudes to politics, the role of the state, the idea of freedom, and the wider contours of European politics. Beneath this continental divide, there is also a series of new divisions emerging within our societies, between young and old, between people who report that they have been economically affected and those who see COVID-19 mainly as a public health crisis, and between those who see the state as a protector and those who see it as an oppressor. My question is, please explain these divides. Do you think they will be lasting? Do they follow the pre-pandemic polarizations, or we are speaking of new cleavages that have emerged?
Thank you very much. The first point is, it's really slightly different from country to countries. There are countries in which you have a very strong correlations outside of Europe between the previous divisions and the divisions that came with the pandemic. The United States is a classical example. To a great extent, your party affiliations very much is going to predict where you're standing on masks or where you stand on vaccinations and so on. Europe was much more complicated, and let's give you slightly more kind of a details on this study, which was done in the summer of last year. What we try to do is ask people about their personal experience. So this was this type of a simple questions. Have you been personally seriously sick out of COVID? Did anybody die in your family? Did anybody die in your very close friendly circle? Have you been really economically badly hurt by the pandemics? And here, as you already mentioned, you see very different experiences. In all of East European countries, majority of the people said at least one of this. Either they have been basically suffering the medical part of it, or the economic impact was very negative. And this is not difficult to be understood, keeping in mind that the possibility of East European states, I mean also Central European states within the European Union to support their businesses and population was much more limited comparing with Western Europe. Then there was countries in Western Europe, like Denmark, in which 70% of the people said none of this. So they didn't have this personal negative experience with the pandemic. Basically, they managed to protect themselves economically. They managed to protect themselves also psychologically in a way. But then you start and look at the level of vaccinations, and it was in the summer, and now we know the data from the latest numbers of vaccination, and you could expect that because of this experience, probably Central and East European countries are going to be much more eager to get vaccinated in order to avoid what has happened, but this is not the case. You have a much higher vaccinations in Western Europe and Southeastern Europe, and much lower vaccination in Central and Eastern Europe. And my own country, Bulgaria, is a champion of being non-vaccinated with around 30%, which is. And then for me, the biggest question was why? What explains it? And as I said, it really differs from country to country. There's some very specific things that should not be ignored. So this generalization always make the world look much more organized than it is. But in my view, there are four factors that should be taken seriously, and they're telling us certain things about also the divisions in Europe as a whole. The first is that we saw that the countries that have been particularly badly hurt by the first wave of COVID, which means the beginning of 2020, were much more eager to go to get vaccinated. Spain, Italy, France. Countries that basically have the shock of people dying and nobody going on the streets. So this type of experience was very much there. The second thing, which also made a very strong impression on me, was that in Eastern Europe, contrary to what people were talking, you can expect that the vaccination could go much easier because there was a lot of obligatory vaccination during the communist period, particularly certain things created to the children's vaccines that have not been very much protested. So while in places like Austria and Germany, you have a kind of a tradition of the anti-vax movement coming both from the left and from the right for different reasons, alternative ways of life, very strong kind of mistrust towards the big pharmaceutical companies and others, which were before any type of pandemic. So this was culturally, it was there. So certain type of things have been mobilized. In Eastern Europe, you didn't have much of this, but you have three other factors that very much, in my view, affected what happened. One is a general loss of trust in governments, of any public institutions. And this is why I was giving the Russian example. Even the fact that you have your own vaccine does not help. Secondly, paradoxically, you can expect that East Europeans were much more ready to get vaccinated because we have quite a lot of mistrust to our medical public health system in general. As you see, basically people don't trust and in a way fear disease also because they fear going to hospitals. But you don't have these correlations. Nevertheless, that people basically are very critical about the state of the public health institutions. They didn't go for vaccination, and then continues the questions why. One of the interesting questions, and I'm now going to give you some Bulgarian data, which probably is the place which of course I know best, but also, as I told you, the country that is least vaccinated. One of the effects, we're going to talk about demography, immigration, and things like this, of the exodus of people from the countries is that the median age of a medical personnel in Central and East European countries has become very high. So basically, the median age of the Bulgarian medical professionals is above 50. It's a different generation of doctors and nurses, which have a much more mistrust, particularly to this type of new vaccines about which they don't know much. And the fact that this kind of personal doctors and others were very hesitant about the vaccine very strongly affected the behavior of the general populations. If your own doctor, whom you know, tell you, I cannot tell you how good vaccine is going to be for you, then the idea that you're going eagerly to go to vaccinate it was not very much there. The other thing that was also critically important is that in places like Bulgaria, we have 3 parliamentary elections for the year of 2021. As you know, in Bulgaria, we like voting, but we're not great at electing governments after this. As a result of it, all kinds of a political energy went for campaigning, for winning elections, and there was not a really concentrated effort of trying to convince people and basically give them an evidence that probably vaccines are not going to solve all the problems, but they're going to make it much easier for people to survive. But the fourth things, and this is critically important, and it goes for cultural change, which at least for me was quite surprising, is the following. One of the things is that the government, in order basically to convince people to get the vaccinations, which I do believe was a good public policy, in a certain way started overselling it. Vaccines is not going to guarantee that you're not going to be infected. The vaccines are not going to guarantee you that you're not going to infect others. But of course, the vaccines is giving you a quite good, at least statistical chance that you're going to have a much mild experience with COVID if you're going to get it. But in order to get people to get vaccinated, many governments went to a rhetoric which was slightly out of the board. If you listen to some governments, basically they almost promise people that they'll never die. This is created also a backlash of its own, particularly in a situation of the publics, which are very mistrustful to many of the messages coming from the government. Social media is the other important element of what is happening. The levels of disinformation in general is much higher in Central and Eastern Europe, relative to the data which the GlobSec has been producing. And as a result of it, you basically have a population which get totally puzzled.
Ivan, let me just interrupt you for a second. Why do you think that the level of trust in conspiracy theories is high or higher in Central and Eastern Europe?
One of the interesting stories that one of the effects of the COVID-19, and this was a thing that I have been struggling when I was writing this early book in April of 2020. For me, question was, is this going to increase the trust in experts? Because this time it's not about financial markets, it's your own health. And you are much more kind of ready to trust your doctor than to trust your banker. Or we're going to see much more conspiracy theories going on. And the interesting story is the latest data, there was a Cambridge University study that shows that as a result of these 2 years of COVID, we have a slight decrease, for example, of the support for the populist policies, but you have an increase of conspiracy thinking all over the board. So in a certain way, as a result of COVID, now everybody is Central and East European. Everybody basically gets broken. Why people are ready to vote for this type of theories? First, because, and this is critically important, normally we said people don't trust science. But one of the interesting stories about science is that scientists all the time disagree with each other. Listen, look at the French debate in the beginning. On the sides of both sides of the debate, you have extremely prominent medical doctors. I mean, this was not just marginal figures, and they totally disagreed about what it is about, what should be done. So it was much easier to, in a certain way, trust the science when there was one doctor in the town. It's much more difficult to trust the science when there are several doctors and you can go on Google and you always can get any opinion that you want basically to find and finding it. So in a certain way, the fact that science works through disagreement is a certain thing that is very difficult for people to grasp. And this is why, and I do believe media in some countries, by the way, Bulgaria was like this, also contributed to this, because for the media, the most important is to try to show the people that all points of view are reflected in the discussion. So then you're going to get one medical doctor who is going strongly to advocate the vaccines, and others who is going to talk about the risks of the vaccines. And for the people, these two opinions are equally legitimate, while in reality, 90% of the medical community is supporting one position and 5% is supporting the other. But this is very difficult to be seen on the TV screen, where the charismatic nature of the speaker is more important than basically how mainstream and how well supported in the professional community this view is. So this is one of the things, the very way the modern science works. Certainly, listen, normally we all trust things that we can check, that we have experience with. I have been always giving this example. If you go on the public opinions and talking about the countries with a very much controlled media, people are trusting this very much government controlled media when it comes to things that they don't know about. But when it comes to their everyday life, they're very well known what is true and what is not true. In the kind of all this COVID story, it's very difficult to have this type of experience. And I do believe one of the problems of the modern world and one of the problems of the crisis of trust in general is that our personal experience is more and more limited, and we all the time are forced to judge and take the decisions based on things on which we cannot rely on our personal experience. You should trust somebody. And this becomes, so this is why, and then comes, because what is conspiracy theory? Basically, conspiracy theory is the fear that things are accidental. Listen, for a normal person, the most difficult things to believe is that nobody's in charge. Just to make the conversation slightly funnier, the other story is that the easiest way to fight a conspiracy theory is not with truth, but with another conspiracy theory. I have a colleague, a very close friend, and she was staying in a hospital and sitting next to a person who was basically very much complaining about all these vaccines and, of course, gates and chips and the classics. So this colleague of mine was so pissed off out of this conversation. So she looked at this person and said, listen, let's tell you I'm a well-informed person. You're right. There is a conspiracy, but you have got the wrong conspiracy theory. In fact, the story is different. There are too many people living in the world. And in a certain way, people in charge have taken decisions that some people should die. So as a result of it, all those who are not vaccinated are going to die. And this same person who had been just 3 minutes ago discussing how dangerous the vaccines are, she said, I smelled something, she said. but they're not going to get me. I'll get vaccinated. Interestingly enough, what is not that people believe in a particular conspiracy theory, but the idea is nothing is accidental. There is a kind of an evil interest. Quite often this interest is commercial. There is a major mistrust to big pharmaceutical companies, and you believe that everything is about profit. And don't forget, part of the strength of the conspiracy theory is that there is always a grain of truth in it. Is it true that basically pharmaceutical companies are trying to make big profits? It's true. Is it true that governments from time to time are overselling what they're doing in order to get the results that they want? It's true. So from this point of view, you're taking something, and of course, part of your suspicions or part of your mistrust is some legitimate source, but then you go wild. You totally exaggerate things that are there. And I do believe this is the biggest story that we're seeing, is that we see a lot of exaggeration. I'm going to end up just on one thing, and this is the generational divide, because this is going to be, in my view, really also politically important for the year 2022. When all this started, it was quite clear that the age is critically important based on how we're going to experience what is happening. Basically, the data shows that the risk of dying out of COVID doubles with every 8 years. So from this point of view, by the way, COVID was a kind of a demographic awakening. The moment when the virus arrived, we all know exactly how old we are. All these stories that 60 is the new 40 and so on, this sounds nice, but basically it didn't help. As a result of it, in the beginning, for very legitimate reasons, all interests have been focused on preserving the oldest members of our societies, because they were most exposed, they were most vulnerable. And I should say that there was incredible demonstration of solidarity that you can see everywhere. Young people trying to protecting their grandparents, doing this and that. What happened, and this changed exactly in the summer of 2020, when you have a much more vaccination, and when you have a generation that is out at school for a while, that cannot go to universities, these young people had the feeling that super precautions coming from the government is not threatening their life, but they're threatening their way of life. And here you see in the opinion polls, there were much higher percent of younger people who believe that their freedom is threatened by the government restrictions than by the spread of the virus. So the young people had the feeling that they're unrecognized victims of the COVID, and that if it goes for a long time, if basically you cannot go to universities anymore, they're losing a lot and nobody's really paying attention to this. So when we had been writing this, this report in the end of the summer of 2021, one of our major recommendations to the government was keep eye on the younger generation. These kids basically cannot go with the status quo like this. Policies that were going to be tolerated in 2020 are going to be self-destructive in 2022.
Oh, thank you, Ivan. I will try in about 5 minutes to ask you several questions, and then we shall open for our audience.
You want to tell me that, unlike Daniela, I didn't manage to be brief. I got it.
The concept of freedom has sprung up in a very strange way. What is freedom? To be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated? What is freedom? In Eastern European countries, people don't seem to care as much about press freedom, but they care about the freedom not to be vaccinated. Question one. Question two, I have to speed up. When we were talking, and you were talking about conspiracy theories, and especially in Eastern Europe and in Western as well, we shall keep in mind that people move, and there is huge immigration, and then we shall come to the demography and democracy. In Austria, I sent you the graph. If we look at how many people were vaccinated in their countries of origin and in Austria, the figures are very similar, which means that people follow the information in their countries of origin more than where they live. I'm sure it would be similar in other countries. And when you comment on this, I will come to another important topic. You will have a very short time, And this is your focus of research, and that is demographic changes that I know concern you a lot, and democracy and who votes in Europe. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Listen, this is really critically important, and the first point is very much just underline what you have said. People live in different countries, but very rarely people leave the information space of their language. And this is particularly true. If you're going to see the East Europeans living in Austria and their level of vaccinations, they're going to be closer to the medium level of their own countries than to Austria as a whole. Of course, there is a quite strong correlations also based on education and things like this. And this is very important because this is also different Europe. We're looking at the people from where they are, not understanding that on major issues, including basically what is freedom, what is democracy, their view is based on the reality of the countries that they come from. And here comes the story of freedom and what it means to be free. Listen, from time to time, I have the feeling that we're slightly kind of harsh on people because it is not easy to understand what it means to be free these days. It's not simply because of COVID, but look about what is happening on the technological sphere, the level of surveillance, the level of information, the level of basically of private data that is used. So once upon a time, the freedom was very much to be out of prison and to be able to demonstrate on the streets without being arrested, to be ready to vote. Now this is becoming much more complicated because one of the things is that you have the feeling that you're free, unfree without even realizing it, that you're manipulated all the time, that there is something against you. And this creates, in my view, this kind of a sense that mistrust became the default option. Before, normally you trust what you see and then start ask questions. And basically mistrust comes as a result of a certain type of a intellectual inquiry. Now we start with mistrust. And this makes it very difficult. I do believe that as a result of it in the year 2022, all the debate about sovereignty is going to be critical, and it's going to be critical on 3 different levels. All the debate about vaccines, and listen, the debate about vaccines has different dimensions. One is about who has the right. What is my right, basically? First of all, do I have the right to get not vaccinated? Do anybody has the right to push me to do this and that, to restrict my freedoms? The obligatory vaccination is a totally different debate. You can be strongly for vaccination and at the same time believing that mandatory vaccination has an issue. And for many of these people, this is strongly ideological view. And you have a strong this libertarianist view, which was much more typical for the United States than it was typical for Europe, that nobody has the right to enter in my private space, nevertheless of what I do. And in my view, this is a radical reaction to the type of a population, particularly young people, that have the feeling that they are losing freedom, but they don't know exactly who is getting their freedom. Because it's not only about vaccine is one of the demonstrations. As I said, a lot goes with the big technological companies, a lot goes with the surveillance mechanisms of the governments in general. And of course, our governments cannot be compared to what is happening to places like China and others, but these young people, they see what is happening in these places. So what it means to be freedom. The second level of sovereignty that is going to be very much, and it's going to be quite critical for the future of the European Union, in a moment of this, in a crisis like this, the problem is, do you need more of a national government? Do you need more of Europe? And this question is standing. And in my view, while we are not going to have this type of a crisis of 2016, 2017, when countries want to get out of the European Union, they're not going to be a second Brexit moment. You're going to have more and more kind of idea that when it comes to certain issues, I'm just trusting my own government. One of the interesting data which I studied that I saw today was that, for example, Bulgarian non-governmental organizations are very highly mistrusted by the public. And the major reasons for this is that they're getting funding from abroad. Where you get your money from, basically inside-outside divide within Europe. is becoming more important than it was 5 or 10 years ago. It was always there, but much more important. And this is why we're going to see many of the member states who said, yes, I'm for Europe, but for example, when it comes to immigration policy, I'm not going to go with a common policy. When it comes to climate policies, I'm asking for exception. So what is the meaning of sovereignty? And quite often sovereignty, particularly for a small country, means the capacity and the power to say no, but not no to your competitors, much more no to your allies. And thirdly, and this is very strong with the French presidency today, of course, comes the problem of the sovereignty of the European Union as a whole. Can European Union be independent policy actor, for example? What is happening, given with the Russia-US negotiations on Ukraine, you can see that Europe is much more on menu than at the table. And while normally this was a particularly preoccupation of East Europeans, that everybody is talking about us and not many people are talking with us, you can see this very much coming as a general European problem. So where you can find your freedom, but also where you can find your autonomy and power on individual level, on national level, on European level, in my view, 2022 is going to be very much pushing debate into this direction. And trying to
Ivan, you answered my third question. I'll come to one more, and then in 2 minutes, I shall open the debate. Well, first, I want to ask you, now that you were speaking about the sovereignty and what to expect in 2022, let's remind ourselves, only 5 years ago, we laughed at Donald Trump, who was promising to build walls. We were shocked when Viktor Orban was constructing barbed wire at the border with Serbia to stop the migrants. Now it's a booming business in Europe, walls and barbed wires. Is Europe becoming Orbanized? That's question one. I remember some colleagues from Hungary said several years ago that Orban is no longer interested in Hungary. He's interested in making impact on European history. Is he managing? That, please, a very short answer. And second question, and then we shall open, is your reflection on demography. You have said some really interesting things about a future of Europe where people who are old will be voting and they are in pension, while those who work that are migrants like you and me here are not voting, or that people who are abroad are voting in their country of origin while they are not contributing. Then different divides. Please, very short, because we have only 23 minutes left and I would like the audience to ask questions.
Yeah, it's not easy, really, to be honest, to answer so briefly, but I'm just going to sketch. First, COVID-19 revisited the three major kind of consensuses, or at least almost consensus, that Europe has reached during the last 10 years on the previous crisis. For example, if you remember Europe's response to the terrorist attacks in places like France or Spain, unlike the United States in 9/11, Europeans were very much kind of reluctant to allow a major surveillance. Part of it was very much based on what we saw in the US with the Patriotic Act. But now, when the COVID came in a totally different situation, and by the way, for very legitimate reasons, we decided that we are going to allow some of these virus tracking mechanisms because this was the only way to protect part of the population, particularly in early stages when the vaccines is also not available. So there was a change. I mean, it was a dramatic change of where we have been in 2015 and where we have been in 2020. Then comes the economic policies. After global financial crisis, the major consensus that was reached, very much under the pressure of countries like Germany, was in the moment of crisis, you're not changing rules. Fiscal discipline is critically important. Austerity policies matters. We're not going to overspend. See what we have been doing as a result of the COVID-19. This is just the opposite of what we did in 2010, 2011. And I'm not making a value judgment, what is right, what is wrong, but it's very important to see the change. And then basically, during the migration crisis, there was not a consensus, but the idea is that we are not going to close the borders. The truth is that in the last 2 years, for very obvious reasons, the borders are closed. So as a result of it, as a result of the COVID-19, when it comes to the problem of surveillance and security, we moved very much to the closer to the US positions. On economy, we moved to the position of the Southern Europe, and on migration, we moved to the position of Eastern Europe. And this is the new reality. You can, Kate, of course, basically many of these arguments have been very much defended by Mr. Orban, but it was also a major kind of a realization that people, as a result of COVID-19, started to see the dark side of globalization much more than before. I don't believe that this is a kind of a certain things that are not going to change with the time, but this kind of a change is here, it's going to stay, and this is very much consensual, and it's enough to see, because also we try to see if before, basically migration was perceived mainly as a humanitarian issue as the result of what happened on the Turkish-Greek border before, and then very much on the Polish Belarusian border. You see also that you have a weaponization of migration. Basically, weaponization of interdependency is the major trend that we see now.
Why don't you have some water? I'll ask people.
No, it's okay. I like kind of many people. I have this positive. I'm positive on COVID, but very mild, so nothing dramatic. So as when you go on demography, it's very big because, in my view, and this is why I'll try to make it really try to summarize into sentences what I'm interested in. We have a major loss of population, and from this point of view, out of the 10 countries in the world that have lost most people in the last, as a percent of the population in the last 10 years, 9 in Central and Eastern Europe. For example, my own country, Bulgaria, has lost 11% of its population for the last 10 years. Listen, it's big. And you have, as a result of it, kind of three trends that go at the same time. You have the small countries, most of them quite ethnically homogeneous, which are losing people because of the fact that more people are dying than kids have been born, because of migration. Also, you have an aging of the population, which is creating a major disbalance between the generations. And as you're saying, this is very much affecting democratic politics. On the last elections in Serbia, 53% of the people who voted are on a retirement age. And at the same time, contrary to what people believe, of course, you have a movement of people. For example, there are almost 2 million Ukrainians working in Poland these days. So the fact that East Europeans' borders are totally closed is factually not true. And the questions that I'm very much interested in is how democracy can function if basically the structure of your political community is the following. 20–25% of the population have a working, they have social rights, they're on the labor market, but because they're non-citizens, they don't have the right to vote. And then basically more than 50% of the people, they're voting, but they're not on the labor market anymore because they're retired people. And 10–15% of the people, they are voting, but they're living abroad and they're not paying taxes in their own country. So what kind of political community it is? What kind of problems you can solve and you cannot solve through electoral politics? So this is one of the questions that really interests me. And paradoxically, European Union is making this type of a situation much more likely than unlikely, because you are saying, yes, we don't have the right to vote. We only can write on certain level on the Vienna elections for the district levels and others. But on the other side, we do not feel like the Afro-Americans basically in the South in the 1960s, because we are voting on the elections in our own countries. And as you noticed before, probably we're following the politics in our native countries more than we're following Austrian politics. So from this point of view, this is this interesting situation in which you have a totally heterogeneous political community, not only territorial, very much also tilted demographically towards the age difference. And then, and this is the last part of my answer, as a result of it, I start to believe that also what you have in democratic politics in general, I see it also strongly in the United States. Also, you have this feeling because of this demographic decline, because of the fact that you're losing population, because of the fact that you have an aging population. You have two kind of a very strong, almost apocalyptic visions of the world that are fighting with each other. One very much comes from the climate activists who said if we're not going to change our way of life, basically in 30, 40 years, there is not going to be a place to live. And I have been just recently reading a study claiming that in the year 2070, 3 billion people could not live in the places that they're living today, if these basically climate projections are true. And on the other side, you have basically the people who are very much obsessed with demography and the loss of population in their own national community who said, okay, but in 2070s, they are almost going to be no Bulgarians, they're not going to be Serbs, they're not going to be Czechs. So from this point of view, you have this type of two apocalyptic visions that are clashing with each other, and they have a very total moral demands on the people. On one level, basically, for many of the climate activists, having more kids in the world, which according to them is overpopulated and the earth simply cannot basically take care of all of us in the way we're living now, is a moral issue. And you're going to see in some of the radical versions saying no kids. On the other side, basically, you have all these people who are preoccupied with the demographic decline of their communities who said if you have less than 3 kids, it's a national betrayal. You're going to be personally responsible. And by the way, if you insist that you're going to have more three or 4 kids, imagine what it means also for the role of the women in the family and so on. So there are many things going there. By the way, also views on homosexuality and others are very much affected by your fears of what is happening on the demographic field. So I'm saying all this because in a strange way, this kind of a very intense versions has something in common, and this is the feeling that we are living in the last days of the civilization is the way we know it. There is a famous American term called preppers. Preppers are the people who basically believe that they're living in the last days of the world. And they behave as if they're living in the last days of the world. And this creates, in my view, this type of intensity, and this, in my view, is much more structuring European politics than the classical left-right divide that have been structuring before. So this is some of the questions that, in a certain way, interest me, and I have much more the questions than the answers. But from time to time, I do believe coming with a good question is enough.
I hope it's not the end of civilization, but it will soon be ending of our conversation, at least this one. So I will ask, just for the to make things faster, people I know, I shall introduce them. Those I don't know, I will ask to introduce themselves. First 2 questions, I will collect 2. It is Philip Noble, Global Voices, Prague, and Karolina Zbigniewska, Euroactive Poland. Philip, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and all the best to all of us for the new year. It's going to be difficult. Thank you so much for this very relevant conversation. I'm the managing editor of Global Voices, and my background is in also China. So my question is actually about the Beijing Winter Olympics, and I would really like to hear about your analysis and views on how the pandemic is being used politically in relationship to the Winter Olympics, but also how it is dividing athletes, national teams, but also impacting sports sponsors. As we are definitely covering this at Global Voices. And I've just read also your book about the pandemic. So thank you so much for such brilliant thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, Karolina. And then I will also ask Hannes Svoboda from International Institute for Peace in Vienna, and then 3 questions. Karolina?
Hi, thank you. It's always a pleasure. So I would like to ask you about the book, The Light That Failed, that you wrote over 2 years ago now. That major conclusion, more or less, was the most powerful force behind the wave of populist extremist driving xenophobia that began in Central and Eastern Europe was a feeling of resentment and the post transformation imperative of Europeanization, Westernization. I would like to ask you if you would write the same book with similar conclusions after 2 years of the pandemic, and if yes or no, what has or hasn't changed? What would be your conclusion today?
Thank you so much. And Hannes Swoboda, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again for this very interesting discussion and presentation. Just one brief comment, and that is that at least in Germany, there was a research done that the vaccination attitude of foreigners is about the same as the Germans with the same education. So you mentioned education. The education seems to be a big influence. My question is on democracy and democratic development in Europe. You had recently election in Bulgaria, you had the election in the Czech Republic, partly in Slovakia, who showed more, let's say, vote against these kind of authoritarian types. On the other hand, you have, of course, Orban, what was mentioned, and Slovenia, and he's trying to find some sort of alliance with Vučić in Serbia and so on. So how do you see these kind of contests between more democratic and less democratic attitudes and the election? Is there something which will characterize Europe in the future, that we have that kind of fight, or do you see some tendency in the one or the other direction? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hannes. Since I see the time going, I will read the 4 question that Tim Judah from The Economist wrote to me. Can you read this question? Okay, given the dramatic democratic decline of decline of Bulgaria, what would you advise the new government to do? So please, Ivan, do a reply to these easy questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's really a great and serious questions that just answering them for 2 or 3 minutes is not going to be fair to the questions, but I'll try to do it. On China, let's start with the fact that I'm sure that you know more than me. I never have been a classical China expert, but my major argument is that China tried to use more strategically the COVID crisis than anybody on 2 different levels. One is for changing the economy, basically creating this type of a double economy, not totally depending on exports and others. And this is very clear that they're doing this. And part of the closing that you see is this. Secondly is consolidation of power and basically trying to destroy some of the kind of alternative centers of power, starting with the big technological companies that we have been seeing. So in a certain way, the closing of China was not only the result of the fact that they have a problem with COVID, but for them, this was the way to try to manage China exposure to the outside world and to the globalization, keeping in mind that in a certain way, this was the major source of economic development for China. As a result of it, the interesting story is how this affects the Olympics, and it affects it in 2 different ways. On one level, they want the Olympics to happen, so they should be the reputational level that China can do everything that they want. And on the other side, they don't want basically the Olympics to have any impact on the domestic situation. Basically, it should be just an event which is going to be seen from outside, and obviously basically not much more seen from China. What I cannot know is how successfully they can do this. This is when I said that I don't know, I really don't know. But one of the interesting things is that really China is more aggressively than anybody else trying to use the crisis kind of to redefine the understanding of borders. For example, any type of a data research coming from China now based on the Chinese citizens, you need a license to get it out and to use it outside of China. So the nationalization of data is becoming the biggest issue on the China side. And of course, it has a lot to do with basically the big data authoritarianism that you have in China. Concerning our book with Stephen Holmes, listen, our major argument we're not going to change. And one of the interesting stories when I said that Eastern Europe does not want to imitate anymore is even connected to the problem of vaccination. If 10 years ago, you're going to have these articles that Bulgaria is the least vaccinated country in European Union, this is going to be perceived as kind of a shame, we're not doing well, you see what others. Now this became a source of pride. All others are kind of idiots, they trust their governments, only we East Europeans know that all this is bullshit. So from this point of view, you have this, but of course our explanation is not explaining many things. They're not explaining either what the governments are doing, how they want to stay in power. This very much going also to the question that Hanna Svoboda had been asking. In my view, there are two different trends going on. One is that many of these kind of governments that came to power as a result of this resentment wave, they created a resentment on their own. In a certain way, you can see that it was in Czech Republic, it was very much clear in Bulgaria that basically there was a populist moment, but there is also an anti-populist moment. People have an experience, and basically this experience make them understand that you're not getting freer out of the fact that your government wants to control your courts. So in my view, there is an exhaustion of the populist moment, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. But it's going to have a different fate in different countries because they're countries, and from this point of view, Hungary is really in a group of its own, where it is so difficult for institutional reasons, for the way the election law have been done, for the way basically power is exercised. It's really very difficult to win elections. Let's put it like this. And secondly, even if winning elections, it's very difficult to govern after this because there's so much, some of these parties have so much embedded themselves in the state institutions that winning the elections does not mean that the new governments are going to have possibility to govern. The other interesting thing that comes out of East European experience of the last years is that normally these populist governments lost elections to a very diverse coalitions, basically covering from the far left for right, in a certain way, very much the Israeli model, because at the end of the day, this is not about the classical left-right, it's very much about democracy itself. But what is changing also, and which I do believe is going to have a very strong effect, is that we see also the major political polarization in the United States being exported. So if when Donald Trump came to power, there was 2 or 3 European leaders supporting them. Now you're going to see a much more kind of a Trumpian-like European right. It's also much more internationalized. It is much more better organized. And my feeling is that they're going to be also much more attempt to create a media environment which is closer to the one that you have in the United States. So what you see in France, I'm even not talking of Central Eastern Europe with some of the candidates, Mr. Zemmour being one of them. So this kind of a combination between fragmentation and polarization that we have very strongly is not over. So even when some of these populist governments are going to lose power, in the case it happened in the Czech Republic, or basically what we saw in Bulgaria, it is still, this is not going to be a return to a pre-populist politics. This is what for me is very important. So one of the interesting questions that very few people are basically discussing is how the post-populist democratic politics looks like. And this is not a return where it was. This is not a return to a kind of a liberal consensus, at least in my view. And then comes Tim's question. Listen, it's not easy to advise any governments on demography. One of the interesting effect of the COVID-19 initially was that, particularly in the case of Bulgaria, you have almost 200,000 people that came back. People start to realize that migration is a two-way street. People are living, but also basically some of the people are returning. Unfortunately, many of the people who now start to return basically are retired people who basically come back with their German pensions and prefer basically to spend them in Bulgaria. But it's so difficult. All of these governments are trying to come with policies that are going to increase the birth rates. There is a pressure, to be honest, on the women for certain type, and this is very much seen in places like Poland, honestly speaking, where you kind of try to convince the women that basically giving birth is their kind of a national duty. But it's not easy to see because we know that in very few places these pronatalist policies are really working. And in order to finish this, I just want to tell you this is not an East European problem. The problem of depopulation is something that is big and it's very different. And I'm just going to give you data for one country that is going to strike you. And the country is South Korea, highly developed, rich country, major model. They have 0.8 child per person. They're spending billions for free kindergarten and policies which normally we expect to work and to give incentives for people to have kids. 40% of the households in South Korea are single-person households. So obviously we're talking about a major cultural change in the developed societies and how it works. And by the way, imagine what it means also for societies that they believe that they're totally founded on family values and others, with this type of demography, with this type of a structure. And this goes not simply in the Western world. China is going to have extremely dramatic demographic problem, and also is a major disbalance between boys and girls as a result of one-child policies. So all the demographic kind of studies in Europe before were very much based on the fear of overpopulation. Too many people. This was a kind of the classical Malthusian vision. For me, discovering the politics of depopulation is something new, something interesting, that it's not only about Europe. This is about developing world as a whole. By the way, when you talk about Russia, one of the major things that you're going to hear in the talk of President Putin recently is that several times he was saying, if it was not for the revolution, if it was not for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russian population is going to be 500 million people. So this idea of obsession of people missed, of not born kids because of certain levels, of the fact that demographic decline means also cultural decline, social decline, economic decline. I do believe this is a new reality, and this is the reason basically why I have this kind of a strong interest on the relations between demography and politics in the modern world. So
thank you, Ivan. So Hannes, you wanted a quick question, and then we shall. Hannes?
He said no.
Ah, he said no.
That was a mistake. No.
Oh, okay. Well, Ivan, we managed to tackle European and world problems and the end of the world basically in 1 hour, which means we shall organize. You have addressed so many issues that we shall be addressing this year and hopefully understanding better. I thank the audience, and I really hope Ivan has inspired you to think, to interview him, to do further research. And I just would like to announce that on the 3rd of February, together with Ivan Voivoda, we shall do an event exactly tackling one of the issues that Ivan Krastev mentioned. And that is that every country is different, and we shall have people from the least vaccinated and the most vaccinated country in Europe explain which arguments worked, pro and contra, because I think that we all get informed really at a very local level when it comes to things that, as you say, we see around ourselves. I thank everybody. Thank you, Ivan. And I really hope next year in Presseclub Concordia, not on Zoom. And in spite of everything you have said that has been fascinating, let's keep a little bit of optimism. It always helps.
No, listen, funnily enough, even if the end of the world is coming, it does not mean that we are not going to have fun meeting it. So from this point of view, yeah, it's not about optimism versus pessimism. Yeah, we should enjoy it. Yeah.
Please get well as soon as possible, Ivan, and I hope COVID is very mild. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mirjana. Thank you, Ivan. And next year, 2023, the 13th of January is a Friday, so it might be perfect to have a meeting.
Yeah.
See you again. Thank you so much.
Okay.